And, you know, I think it's interesting with me because obviously all the way through this, while you've been doing the podcast as well, you are a stand-up comedian. You've been coming up with shows most years, I would say. You've been doing, I mean, you've got a very, very great back catalogue. And I think it was interesting to hear, again, talk on episode 300, again, 4 or 5 years ago, about how you now were getting to the point where you wanted to write on stage or, you know, rather than at home, which, you know, I went through in my load of shows. I started off having scripts, basically, that I would, you know, I would adapt, but not very much. And now I go on with some ideas and do it all there. And it sounded like you were at that
Yes,
sort of
I was sort of approaching that. I was kind of, I've had lots of sort of fascinations with comedy along the way, besides the obvious comedian's fascination with oneself. I was trying to get into that, mostly just because it seemed efficient. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? You might as well. Paul Sinner told me years ago on like episode maybe 5 of my podcast, so like 11, 12 years ago, that he writes in his car and he just would hold it all in his head and never make any notes, and that fascinated me. But it seemed to me that when I would tour, I would do like an hour in the first half. I would do the show they've come to see in the first half, and then I'd say, come back after the interval, I'm going to fuck about for an hour from some notes that I kind of half remember, and distressingly, it's often way better. And I just found that I think actually what my funniest suit is funniest suit isn't an expression. I'm trying to do strongest suit. But
for you,
comedy. When I'm panicking and going and blurting stuff out, I'm often that's when I'm funniest. And I realise now, we talked about not particularly bringing up ADHD because it's such a well-worn thing. But it does occur to me, I'm recently diagnosed and excitingly on new meds tonight. I may need to go off stage for a wee, which I imagine will be accompanied by some wonderful shivery sensations. Which is what always happens when people talk about me when I've just left the room. Come on, this is a terrible time to lose your place. Yes, what I realise is in the moment, you know, you get diagnosed with ADHD and you look back for a month or so, you spend a month or so looking back, oh God, and I suppose that, and I suppose that, and I suppose that. And actually, I've realised very recently that I know I have a terrible memory, but I've realised very recently the effect that has had on how I've grown as a comedian, the choices I make, the choices I don't make because I just do what seems obvious. A lot of it, if I'm ever nervous, it's because I'm worried I'm going to forget what I'm going to say. Right. And I never knew that. Yes. I never realised that. Everything was an attempt to sort of having cards on stage and desperately, you know, I pace around beforehand running the running order. But I'm fine. If I forget what I'm going to say next, I'll be fine. I'll think of something. Yeah. But it's just taken years to get to that point.
I think, but I've talked about this before, but I remember like early on when I came back to stand-up, I saw Reg D. Hunter apparently just improvise a whole set. He arrived a bit late and then just sat down and improvised this amazing stories of, it felt improvised. Yeah. And maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but it felt improvised. And I thought, wouldn't that be amazing to just do a whole show without prepping anything at all? Yeah. But that's what these podcasts are, isn't it? I mean, you know, there's a little bit of like working out what we're going to do beforehand, but you're getting someone who you might know a bit. I mean, you and I have met a few times, we don't know you that well, and you've got to form a double act for an hour, and then we've got to be funny. We're not doing very well in this bit, but we'll pick up in a minute, and there you go, we're off. So it's you know, so it's kind of really liberating to leave that behind. And you do, you know, like often people say, oh, you're, you know, someone's get like comments on Twitter going, your stand-up's no good. And I kind of realise they've only listened to the stand-up at the beginning of the podcast, right? Yes. Which is literally me taking something that happened on the day or something I've just looked at on Google and trying to see what happens with it. So, you know, that's the first go at something.
Yes. It's very brave to open your podcast episodes with some improvised stand-up.
Yeah, but I've just got used to it, and then when you're used to it, it doesn't matter. And you know, it's sort of none of it matters, does it?
No, nothing. I remember none of it matters. Big moment from an early podcast of mine with Tim Vine, right? Where he said we were talking about bad gigs, and he said it doesn't matter, and I said what doesn't, and he went nothing matters, and it was a lovely moment of inner Vine.
But you will find you'll find the as long as you've we've both been going for many decades, and if we can't find the laugh in something, even if it's to go for the obvious or the cheapest thing you can go to. But, you know, hopefully you'll find, you know, you do find, and with the show I'm working on now, I know the story because it's the story that I lived through, but you'll find, you know, if you let everything go and just tell the story, you'll find new avenues, and hopefully, I never record it, I just hope I remember the next day.
Yeah.
And if it's good enough, hopefully you do remember it the next day.
I could never do that because I would probably remember the next day, but I just... I couldn't relax that day knowing that I didn't have it written down somewhere to check in a panicky way. Rory Scovel. Do you know Rory? Have you had Rory Scovel? He's one of those American comedians that I get on my podcast that are of interest to almost no one, because American listeners can't stand my accent and British listeners don't know who the Americans are, but I persevere. And Rory, I mean, he is a genuinely fantastic... We were talking about Mike Birbiglia earlier on. Rory is just up there in terms of his comedy. And he genuinely goes out and improvises whole shows.
Yeah.
But I see the parallels when you say, you do a podcast, but having someone to bounce off is a million years away from not having someone to bounce off. Yeah. So to go out there, and obviously we know people like Todd Barry and stuff, they do the crowd work show. He does it, he's like, I'm not going to do any crowd work, I'm going to do a show. You know what I mean? I'm just going to riff an entire show. And I saw Tommy Tiernan do that once at Edinburgh. He did that every night for a month. And the object was to go out and not say anything he'd ever said before. Just like that 3-year-old drawing and painting kind of idea. Just phenomenally difficult and mad.
It is. In lockdown, and I pretty much stuck to this, not entirely, but in lockdown I decided, and I hadn't done stand-up really for ages, I did a couple of online gigs in lockdown, and I decided, because some of my jokes were literally 25 years old, a couple of jokes in my charity set, when I'm just doing the jokes.
Yeah.
Some of those jokes are, from the early 1990s.
Yeah, so I'm going to think of my stuff as my charity set. That's a lovely spin on some old material.
So I said, right, I'm never gonna do any of that material, material I've done on stage after I come off. And I've maybe, sometimes you need to reference, there's a reference to an old joke in the current show, but I've stuck to it really pretty much, apart from occasionally when I've been very scared at a charity gig and just done something I know that will get a laugh.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think that's especially when you've been going for a long time, I think that's a really good thing to do and an interesting thing to do. Definitely,
because you have to change, because otherwise you sort of calcify, I suppose, and that's not good for your head. I mean, I did talking of older jokes, I've had a thing go viral. I've had the same clip or the same joke in a couple of different clips, but the same joke go viral on Instagram a few times in the last year, and it's like, massively multiplied by Instagram followers. And it's like a less than 30-second joke. It's about baby sign language, or what I now know to be called sign language, but for babies. That's partly why it goes viral, is because people argue in the comments about whether or not the term baby sign language is offensive to sign language users. I have no position on that. But fucking hell, if people argue, you suddenly understand how Joe Rogan exists. Mad. But that has been seen by something like 30 million people now. And it's just mad to think to yourself, well, I'll probably never do anything else that's going to get sued by 30 million people. I'll be trying, but that's my legacy. You always used to, as a newer comic, you have that conversation like, oh, if us comics in this car on the way to a gig, if this crashed, who'd be the news story? And now I'm just kind of faced with, I've really tried to make a significant contribution to this kind of archival idea of stand-up and kind of creativity and what have you. And I'm going to be, remember that offensive baby sign language naming guy? He's dead now.
Well, you aren't in control. I think that's what you've got to relinquish control as a comedian, as any artist, I think. Calling myself an artist there, suddenly I realise. I've got a solution to that. I always used to ask people, do you consider yourself an artist or an entertainer? Yeah.
And I spend my life in kind of paroxysms of panic about, well, who am I? What does that even mean? And I realised you can just be a bad artist.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, great.
But you have no control of how something is enjoyed or what happens to it, where it goes in the world, and so you've just got to put it out there, or indeed how anyone enjoys it. So you don't have control over how you might have an intention behind a joke that people take a different meaning to it. So.
Yeah, I've done a bit recently. I live in Bristol, and there's a bit that went up a few weeks ago, or months ago maybe, about kind of being a London wanker that moved to Bristol and ruined it. And it's a sort of joke in which I admit that, and it's funny. It contains, look it up. It's just under the one with all the views. But that one, they've started to fucking triangulate where in Bristol I live. I feel like it's not like 4chan stuff yet, but there's enough people going, that has got to be Victoria Park he's talking about. It's not, it's bloody not. Clearly Clifton, come on, mate, do the math. No, so...
Don't narrow it down for them, Stuart. Don't help them.
It's neither of those. It could be either of those places.